Hi, watercolor students. I'd like to offer an overview on some commonly used watercolor methods or techniques. And this particular demonstration is geared specifically towards our Northwest Pollinators project that we'll be doing this coming week. So in terms of the techniques, you might use something called dry brush, you might use something called wet and wet, you might use something called stippling, or you might be using glazes. These are techniques that are often incorporated with one another. One may dominate over the other, but often you're doing a number of these things in the same paintings. And it's just a kind of process or method that will get you particular kinds of results. So to start with, I just wanted to talk about the palette. First of all, getting your palette set up. And we covered this already somewhat in class, but the sooner you just get your pigments squeezed out into the little wells on your palette, the better. And they can, watercolor, the pigments can be worked on when they're freshly squeezed out, and they can be worked with when they have already dried and then have been reactivated. And in this case, in this palette, I've been doing this, I've had this for 20 years. And I just keep refilling the color. And I don't know which is the new color and which is the old color. It doesn't particularly matter. But when the color starts to get a little bit low, like over here, I haven't replaced this color yet. Well, then I just squeeze some more color out. So you don't have to use it all up before you start on the next color. But just try to get used to squirting it out into the wells and then reactivating it every time you use it. It's going to work fine, and it'll be very similar to those cake watercolor sets that you're probably familiar with. Now, this is not the only way to do it, but this is, I think, a very mainstream way of working, and it can be very helpful, very beneficial. So that's number one. When you go to work, you want to get your watercolors moistened. So whenever, presumably these have dried, since the last time I've used it. So I want to get them moistened again. So often we'll take a spray bottle. I keep one handy, or you could just drip fresh water into each little well. So I'm reactivating the watercolors so they're ready to go and easier to use. And I don't have to work as hard getting the pigment up. I've got some brushes I'm going to work with, and this is my all-purpose brush. And then I have, this is not a watercolor brush, but it's just a synthetic nylon kind of flat brush. It works pretty good for washes, like if I wanted to do a bigger, broader area. So that's handy. And then I have an acrylic brush here that I might use to try to do some dry brush. It's got stiffer bristles. So if I do dry brush, I want it to be more grainy. So this might be helpful. And then I just have another stiffer kind of acrylic brush. But if you had just only one brush, probably you would want to use something like this. This is a number 12 round brush. Works great. Okay. So as far as the setup is concerned, I have my palette nearby. I have some water just off screen. I have a towel that I can, a rag or any absorbent kind of fabric that when I clean my brush, I can kind of blot the paint off or blot the water off on the rag so my brush isn't too watery. Or sometimes I just kind of dip the brush in and get the majority of the water out, but I still want it to be somewhat liquid. And then I have also a scratch paper over here that I can use to test colors out with, if I'm, want to see what a particular color looks like and play around with, diluting it or whatever. This is my test paper over here. Then I can take that directly to the paper. And you can even use that somewhat as a palette too, if necessary. All right, so that's basically the setup that one needs. I have my watercolor pad. This is a a 11 by 15-inch pad. This is probably standard. And then I'm putting it onto a book so that it's just slightly elevated at an angle. I can see it better that way, and looking down on it better, so I have a better sense of proportion when I can see it more at an angle. And then also it'll make the paint won't run, but it'll kind of make it flow a little bit down, maybe settle it a little bit more evenly. If when we're doing really, really watery work, then you might want to just have it completely flat. But I think this is helpful for now. Right now, it's kind of, it's very soft, but you can see I've done a very simple pencil sketch of a hummingbird. Hummingbird is a really common pollinator, and I'm going to use that as the resource. And then I have a photograph that I want to have easy access to. So if you're not one who has a printer, you're not one who has books, and all you have is a computer screen to look at, well then have the computer screen in proximity, not too close to your water, where you're going to spill it, but have your reference material nearby, preferably straight in front of you, that you can see and just use, go back to again and again and again. And that will make things a lot easier too. You can, first of all, we want to focus on observation. We don't want to purely invent. We want to focus on observation because you can test out these methods a little bit easier. Even when you're inventing, you're still looking at stuff. You're still using reference material. And then I wanted to also to show this. I'll hold this up a little bit. Here are some techniques we're going to explore today, and I'll point them out when I'm doing them. Wet and wet, which is just what it sounds like. Blotting or lifting, often you're removing, you put paint down and you can remove it, to get kind of a highlight. You can do that when the paint is both wet and after it's dry. Dry brush, we talked about that a little bit. It's kind of more grainy, less liquid involved in that. Hatchings or stipples are different types of marks you use for texture to give more information about the surface of the form that you're painting. And then edges, edges are really important. How you define a form. Is it a soft edge? Is it a hard edge? How do you get those different sorts of effects? And then finally glazing, which is like putting on a transparent film, or we call them washes. Sometimes you need to glaze over a color again with maybe a similar color, darker version of that color, but often you're glazing to adjust the overall image. So these are the things that we're approaching today. All right, so I have my hummingbird, and the first method I'm going to play with, and this is very typical of starting out a painting, to play with wet into wet, wet and wet. Now, it can be very controlled, or it can be much more open and loose. So wet into wet can be confined within a shape, which is what I'm going to start with now. So I want to get this basic quality of the hummingbird with just wet and wet first, which won't give me many details, but it'll give me a general sense of where the color is dispersed, where the light and dark values are dispersed, and so on. That's what I want out of the wet into wet. It's a wonderful natural blending method. And you'll find that if you try to blend with your brush over and over and over and over, you're just going to ruin your paper, and it's going to just look messed up. It'll just turn to mud, and your paper will start to kind of degrade. If you allow the color to blend naturally using the wet surface to blend, then it's going to look much more, deliberate and, and effective. What I think is interesting about wet into wet in terms of this hummingbird is the iridescent colors that you see on the feathers. There's like a blue green, a yellow green, a green on the back. I can't blend all that, but I can kind of let the water blend it naturally. So I'll show you how that's done. And then in the head, it's mostly kind of a red violet color, but within that red violet, there's like more of a red, and then there's kind of a purple, and then there's more of a very pale kind of pink. So all of those colors will come into play. All right. I don't know how to make this go fast other than just work in real time. But as always, you can speed up the video. So to start this wet into wet, I'm gonna go with the breast, and I'm just using maybe a tad of color, like dirty water, basically, just so I see where I've put the paint down. And I'm going to get this general section wet over here with my dirty water. And then I'm going to start dropping color into it. So it's the breast and part of the back of the hummingbird. I'm going to go, so I have this general area kind of wetted, and then, it's going to start to dry. So I don't need to really go beyond that for the moment. All right. So then in terms of how the color is used, you just go for the kind of, you assume every color has a few different tones, like there's a kind of brownish quality on the breast, but there's also white in there too. And it's sort of a warm brown and a cool brown. So I'm just finding the colors on my palette that are the most related, and I'm going to use a couple different kinds. And I'm going to just start kind of dropping in sort of tones, wet into wet tones. And you see how the paint just naturally disperses. And it softens, it goes on as a more concrete mark. The wetter your paint, the more of the water disperses. So there's some texture going on there. Then I'm going to bring in a little bit of more dark brown here. And the markings are maybe a little bit more distinct over here. But so far, everything's just kind of natural. And then starting up here, the wing and the back, there's some yellow green. And I'm going to start in with that. And I'm just going to drop that color in, and it's just going to naturally merge with the brown. And, it's not going to go too far from where I placed it. Kind of going around the wing here. And then going up to the back, it's still that kind of green color, but then blue enters into it. This is how I'm going to try to get that iridescent quality. And I'm just going to go around the wings right here. There. So now I'm going to take blue. I'm going to take a nice kind of turquoise blue, aqua blue. And then I'm going to I'm going to drop it into that green. And I'm trying to keep the color somewhat transparent. Now over here, I don't want this edge to be too strong. So I just clean my brush and I just put some wet right along that edge, and so that the paint would just kind of naturally flow and not have like a real hard edge. So really I'm just following whatever the color patterns are, and the surface is relatively wet. I'm just adding in colors as necessary. And then I even see where the blue gets even a little darker over here. So I'm going to add a little bit of ultramarine blue, which takes that, that blue-green into like this whole kind of rainbow spectrum. Green, light green, yellow, yellow green, green, blue green, and then finally blue, and you got that whole spectrum. That's what makes it look sort of iridescent. All right, so just blocking in the colors. This is dried somewhat. If I want to come back and get some soft kind of downy marks, I can add more. They kind of go in these rows. And then knowing that at some point I can come back and add more if I need to. All right, so now I'm going to do the head. Same kind of process. And remember, this is like just the beginning. And then one, has to let the paint kind of dry and settle and see what the results are. Then you come back and you try some more. So now with the head, it's kind of a range of reds, as I mentioned. So, so I'm just going to do the shape of those basic colors. Start out with just, again, just kind of dirty water, just so I can see where I'm painting. And it's okay if my color just kind of naturally intersects or bleeds into the other color. That's the whole idea. That's what will make it look more convincing. And then there's a kind of a red cap that goes over this way, and then around the eye. And then kind of down in this direction. So that's where all my reds will be. And now I'm going to drop in a little bit more intense color, starting with sort of a warmer red that I have on my palette. This is like a cadmium red light, I think. And then what I'm trying to do is exaggerate that color range too. I would say always exaggerate what you see, and then it'll come out about right, because your watercolors tend to get pale anyway. So starting with a little bit of that just red as a base, and see how it naturally kind of bleeds into the other color. That's that natural blending. So now I'm going to a red violet. This is a phthalo crimson, and I know that it's a cooler color. It's a cooler version of red. It's just different down here on my palette. And I'm going to drop that in. And that's just going to sort of naturally blend. And I have to keep saying you can't do this intentionally. It just happens, and you have to kind of accept it and collaborate with it. So that's pretty good so far. Sometimes when I have a stroke that I don't want it to be like really distinct yet, I just take the brush and soften out the stroke. I clean the brush, soften out the stroke. And then here's where my red can maybe be a little bit of a harder edge along the beak. Leave the details for later. There now as the, and there's even a few spots of red over here. I didn't make this area wet yet, but I can just add some red. There. And then now I can see some purple. So I happen to have some purple on my palette. You can mix purple, of course, if you have a red violet a red, violet, and like a ultramarine blue make excellent purple. So I'm going to add the purple in. And I'm going to use it almost to kind of outline a little bit too. And, you know, it's just going to look a lot better if it's not rendered, but if it just seems to kind of get there on its own. And that's the advantage to this wet in the wet method. I can, you know, I can clarify later, but I think that's a really kind of crucial aspect of this. Just put a little kind of purple there. All right, making good progress. And you can see how the shape starts to fill in a little bit. All right, so the next thing I want to do is some of these tones on the wing. And in this case, I can stay with wet. I'm going to just stay with the wet and wet. So I'm just kind of doing some darks there. You have to be careful sometimes if you don't want your colors to merge, then just be careful about going along the edge of another color. So I might touch this green just a little bit and it's going to bleed into the wing, but it's all right. The wing's more brown. So I'm just doing these kind of feathery shapes. Now I let that happen so that I could show another method. It's just called blotting. And this can be done when the paint is wet. And then it's called lifting if the paint is dry. So right now the paint's wet. So I can just take a tissue or an absorbent rag and I can just blot away the color, and then it's not going to run onto the wing. And then I can just, you know, proceed. And I want the wing to be more brown. So then I can just proceed with my brown and paint it right into the blue. And then I just, you know, I don't want it to look as if I don't want the wing to look separate from the rest of the body of the bird. So then it's worth my while to kind of just let some edges just kind of disappear. So I'm kind of doing the general shape of some of the feathers. And it's a range of kind of dark, cool browns and the kind of more reddish browns and orange browns, that sort of thing. So I'm using these colors. And here's some more wet into wet, where I kind of bring and these are, you know, these are some of the feathers on the bird's beating wing. But you know, see how that just kind of natural, you just kind of use these, you let the paint just kind of blend together and it just looks a lot better. All right, so down here, so what I'm trying to do is fill in the general shape of the bird. So up here, the breast is kind of whitish, and I have an option of, you know, I could work over here and make this dark, and that would make the white of the breast white, but I'm not going to do the background. So I need to make the breast some sort of color, or I need to outline it in some way. But for now, I'm just going to, you know, fill in some pale, very pale color. And then I'm going to blot the paint a little bit. Just to complete my shape. And I don't want the purple to show up too much there. So I'm blotting. There, and that's, now I have kind of a shape, but it's still, white-ish. All right, so now continue on the head. The base is kind of a green, and it sort of mixes with the reds. So this will have both. This will have both kind of red and green in it. I'm using a light green, and I'm gonna do the wet first. There's a sort of a banded area around the eye that doesn't actually have much color, so I'm leaving that there. And then I'm just putting this kind of greenish wash down. Now this could, there are some natural forms that don't have this range of, kind of complicated imagery, or complicated color, I should say. So it's not always going to be this complex. I chose this though because it had such a spectrum on it. All right, now I've got my basic shape down, and I'm going to add a little bit more color. And especially over here now, I want to start adding some blue-green. And that kind of, merges with the back. And then eventually even a little bit of red in there, which will create some kind of neutral tones for the, when it's mixed with the green, then it kind of neutralizes the red. So you get these sort of earthy tones in there as well. There. And so now I'm taking the green and I'm mixing it, literally mixing it with the blue-green. I'm going to mix it with the purple, red. I just want kind of like a more earthy version. And then I'm going to come around like that. To manipulate some of this area. And eventually, there'll be some little maybe scaly type feathers in the head that I'll want to try to work with too. But, for now, that's the once over. So just kind of working with a shape, working with these kind of selected areas of wet into wet color. And then there'll be another round where one comes in and adjusts using some of these other techniques. I've got to get the beak in there, of course. Had to hold my breath to do that so my hand wouldn't wiggle. But see, I'm just using the tip of this brush, and you can get some pretty precise lines. And even this brown here has a range of colors. It's, it's kind of blue, it's kind of brown. It's, it's not just this inert color, like it's not just black. I'm adding like a dark kind of Payne's gray right now. Along the border. Just to make it a little bit more precise. And see how the patterns kind of coming together. Now, if I wanted sort of a highlight on the beak, you know, like where the sun's catching it or something, it's kind of glinting, I can lift a little bit of color out. Maybe gives it some dimension. So what I did is I cleaned my brush and then I lifted the paint out like that. And then the eye is important. And some of these things are so complex, you can't just do them one time over, but the eye to me just looks very dark. Maybe there's sort of some blue in it. So I'll start with a little blue, but it's going to ultimately just be kind of black. And I'm going to just make this shape. And I want to leave a little bit of a shiny highlight on it. Now here's where I'm not working wet into wet. I'm just working with wet paint on dry paper because of the precision of the shape. And then I'm going to add some Payne's gray, which is the equivalent of black, into this color. In fact, I'm going to lift out a little color. Just to make it look more round. I'm going to get sort of like a little bit of a highlighted area and eye. Right now, and I'm lifting color, so I'm taking it away with my brush, and then, you know, using a rag, or I've got some tissue here. Now I'm going to come back with a slightly different variant of that dark, which is more of a Payne's gray. Sometimes it takes like a couple passes, and sometimes you can get it kind of on the first try, but I just want it to be darker. And I want that blue to be there, but not like super blue. But I want there to be aspects of both. There's the eye for the moment. And then it'll have some stuff around it. So anyway, the bird is materializing. And then I need to just create more specific marks at some point. Like just an additional shape there that I wanted to get in. There's going to be some dark around the eyes. And then let's see, on the back, going to create some more green. Light green, start with a light green base. Now, I want to replicate that wet into wet. I forgot I'm doing wet into wet. So making a kind of just generally wet area first. And I want to continue this green pattern down on the back. So I have a very pale kind of green going on, kind of just washing it over some of the browns already so that they will appear to kind of blend or merge with one another. And now I want to go to adding some yellow green here, right along the flank. As that color goes down the back towards the tail. So you'll see the paint will just kind of crystallize and naturally dry in these funny patterns. That's an advantage of watercolor. That's not a bad thing necessarily. That's a reason you would choose watercolor, because it has particular properties that you would want to exploit. But you know, at least in my mind, for instance, holding this thing up to the camera. You can't render that. You can't sit down with this teeny tiny brush and make that happen. You just have to let the paint do it. And then this, this looks much more kind of naturalistic than, say, if you tried to render that with a brush. This is in character with the way that the color shifts and changes on the surface of the hummingbird. So I think it's more an issue of just kind of recognizing these things and accepting them and trying to exploit that, that quality in the paint. So here's a close-up version. All right. So now I have my yellow green on the flank, back, and I want to make it darker. So then I'm going to go to a turquoise blue, and I'm going to integrate the turquoise blue into that wet surface. It's dried a little bit because I was talking so much, but I can still, it still has sort of a soft edge to it. And I can, I can do this kind of little dot pattern if I want. Show some of the scale-like feather patterns. And then finally, I'm going to go in with that deeper blue, ultramarine blue. And then add it here in the darkest area. And for me, that somehow really helps it turn the corner. There, and then I'm just letting trying to maybe nurse the paint a little bit, but trying to let nature take its course in terms of how this dries. Now I know that I have the option then later of coming back and making more specific details if I want. And then I'll be doing other methods such as glazing and adding some texture with stipples or hatchings or whatever. But now basically I have the color patterns laid out in the bird and it's ready to go. One last thing here, just to kind of finish the shape off, is want to continue the breast, the kind of dark pattern on the breast. And so I was using some kind of ochre colors, kind of that orangey ochre color. I think it's called raw sienna. And then I was integrating that with some darker brown, some burnt sienna, kind of like, sort of like little dots. And then even a little Payne's gray, which is more cool. So all of those colors kind of create that impression of brown. Gives it more of a, that shimmering spectrum quality that you always wonder, well, how could I, how does that happen, and how could I possibly make that happen? And to me, this is the closest way you can the closest in proximity you can get to that quality is just by kind of letting the paint naturally do that. I was doing already kind of a little outlining thing just to make the edges more crisp. That can happen, during this process. It can happen throughout the process. It can happen in the end. But anyway, now I have, basically this hummingbird shape. So far, I have used pretty much only the wet and wet technique, and I did some blotting. Now I'll show an example of some more blotting. Right here, I don't know if I can actually get that white again, but I can potentially lift a little bit of that color out. So I'm cleaned my brush. I got the paper wet and trying to let the paint dissolve a little bit. Here's where you mustn't overwork too much. If it's going to lift, it will lift, but you can't, it doesn't want to, you can't make it. Some colors are more easily lift, other colors don't. There. Well, I don't know if I got much up, but I did get some. Let's see if I can lift on where it usually works where the color is more saturated. So over here on the head, if I wanted to kind of have a glint, a highlight on top of the head, I got a clean brush, and then I'm just painting the surface with water. Let it dissolve a little bit, and then taking a tissue or a rag and then blotting. That's called lifting. Blotting, lifting. It's lifting because I got the surface was already dry, and then I went back and lifted out color. So when the color is pretty saturated, you know, it has a stronger effect, but it's kind of like erasing into the color. So that's lifting. So we've done wet into wet, we've done blotting or lifting. All right. So let me move on to some of these other techniques, and I can just discuss them in general. I'm going to put this aside for the moment. Bring my test piece over here. All right, so dry brush, I'm just going to show it first in the abstract. Dry brush is when you're not using so much water. So if you want to, you know, well, it works like with animal fur, or in the case of we're doing pollinators, bumblebees, you know, have that kind of fuzzy quality. That might be an ideal vehicle for playing around with dry brush. So I'm going to show that. And so I've got this brush, it's a stiffer brush. And what I'm doing, getting some not too watery paint, just a little bit more, you know, more paint, less water, stiffer mixture. And then I'm going to try to pick up this kind of grainy quality of texture on the surface. And so you can kind of see the you see the bristles of the brush. You can see there where that could be advantageous for creating a certain awareness of surface texture. And then of course you could augment that with your paint, and hopefully you would. You want to avoid the strict kind of technique-y aspect of it. You want to employ it towards something that's more noble. It's not just a technique, it's kind of a vehicle to get you somewhere. So then I'm taking the paint and just adding more dimension and definition to it. But you could see where that might be helpful with, you know, with some kind of, you know, fuzzy looking surface. And I'll demonstrate that in a minute on a bumblebee. So that's another technique. Just in terms of pure technique too, I wanted to show maybe an advantage of or this quality of lifting. So here's lifting or blotting. So first I make say I'm making sky. And just trying to do a flat wash here. Disperse the paint evenly and then have it kind of run down a little bit. Some people are just really good at this, but having it run down is going to dry more naturalistically. Now, in the process of it drying or after it's dry, if the paint is relatively saturated, you can go in and lift out shapes. So I want some cloud shapes, cumulus clouds. So I'm literally lifting out paint. Now, if I want a background for my hummingbird, and then I could do that also when this paint dries. And then I can add additional color. Kind of getting that flat bottom of the cloud where it's, reflecting the color of the earth. So then it gives it a little dimension. Make it slightly softer by softening up edges. And then maybe some billowy stuff going on. There, that would be an advantage of something like lifting. Hold it up close to the camera. So when it all dries, it should look relatively naturalistic. The same thing, with this, with letting the paint do its thing, you can get a better representation of these organic kind of earthy effects, as opposed to trying to render everything real perfectly. Hold that at the right angle. There we go. All right. Okay, another technique while we're here would be hatching or stipples. So that just in terms of texture. Here's texture, hatching, stipples, these sorts of things, dots, just anything that gives you more information and detail about a surface. These are things that can be layered onto an image. Hatching implies more of a line. In drawing, you learn how to cross hatch. And then stipples, you're just kind of massing dots. And stipples, I think, would work really well. Say you're trying to do an echinacea plant, and that kind of central core of the echinacea plant has all those little spikes in it. Well, you can't paint every little spike, but if you do a bunch of little dots, you can get something to that effect. I realize it's a long way away from the camera. Okay, so going back to this image, it has reasonably dried. There's a few kind of puddly areas around. So now I want to come back with more detail, and potentially I could employ some hatching stipples. I could try some dry brush on it. Oh yeah, I was going to do a bumblebee. So I'm gonna put this aside for a moment. I'll bring it back. So now I'm going to do a bee. This time, because I'm in a hurry, I'm just going to kind of make the shape in yellowish tones, because I know I can't go wrong, or it's a honeybee, it's not a bumblebee. And more yellowish tones, just to kind of get a general, general impression of the shape. I'm not going to draw it. I'm just going to kind of paint it out in color. And then, this color will, as I layer more color into it, it's just going to disappear. Sometimes if you do things more directly, it will it has a kind of a more lively effect. So that would be the advantage of painting directly. But if you're not confident about your drawing skills, it can be very nerve-wracking. So I would understand why people wouldn't want to do it. So I'm just going to, here's a basic wing shape. Try not to let it get too dark. And then, but you know, starting out with this kind of color, sort of color brush rendering, you can make corrections and so on, because it's very light. So in terms of the body, just kind of generalizing the body. It's kind of three sections of the bee, the tail, the kind of the midsection, and then there's a head. And then there's some legs that come out, segmented legs. I'm making these little outlines and they will disappear if I want them to. Or I could also reinforce them later. There's another leg here. Comes out from under the body. It's kind of elliptical shapes. There's a segmented part of the leg. And then they're almost like crab legs. And one more leg up in front. If you're off on the shape a little bit, no one's going to know, because we don't scrutinize these creatures that are not humans. We don't scrutinize their shapes as carefully as we do ourselves. So if I'm off with my proportion, I just need to be kind of in character. All right, so I have just very simple rendering of a bee. Here's the tail. And then there's some segments. Where you see those stripes. And this is just kind of a roadmap. Oh, there's this giant eyeball that's probably important to indicate. And the head. And then finally an antennae. The eye's actually, oh, the eye's really big. I'm correcting my drawing here. Yeah, there's the eye. And I'm correcting this, so I'm just taking it away. All right, and then finally the antenna. Which is kind of a segmented form. And then since that's so simple, I'm just going to make it darker from the outset. So I made the mark with a darker color. And I'm just kind of dropping some gray, deep gray, Payne's gray into that. And then it's kind of naturally settling there. Here's a close-up look of my drawing. And then also I've noticed I need to correct something over here just a little bit. I want to make it the back more arched. So I'm kind of bringing the back up. And then the leg I want to put over here. So then I'm just going to kind of correct some of the stuff I did over here by just scrubbing it away. There. All right, now, what I want to do is I want to try some dry brush on this. I think that would be pretty cool. I'm going to start first by, here's the image, by the way. So you can see it's kind of fuzzy. So I want to incorporate that. I want to make sure my surface is relatively dry, or I'll be using that. So getting the toilet paper, roll out again, and I'm just going to blot dry some of these areas that are wet, where I have my general sketch. And before I get too detailed, I'm gonna try a little dry brush. And the hair's kind of brownish, I guess. So I've got some of that on my brush. And then I'm just gonna see if I can get that quality. And then once I'm done with a dry brush, then I can go back and add more texture. And it kind of approximates these qualities, but is it going to be exactly what? And one can certainly go way too far with this. It's kind of dragging the brush over the paper. To pick up some of that, the coarser textures. And to make the edges, of the form, a little bit fuzzy, like they actually are. But I certainly don't want it to overpower. And I mentioned before, you can go way too far if you treat this stuff like just a technique, like an effect. Effects are just effects. They don't lead to anything permanent. You have to employ the effect towards, something that's more real, tangible. I'm getting, as I get more comfortable with it, then I'm getting more brave. Once I know what it's doing. And just a few more areas. the fuzzy parts on the legs are more yellow. So I was making that more yellow. All right, so the wing, of course, does not have hairs coming out of it. Just a little bit more over here. Okay. All right, so now that's, generally speaking, that's my fuzzy bee using the dry brush. And then I can come in and make more specific, create more specific information on the form. So, additional, what we call washes or glazes. Transparent washes of color, glazing, transparent washes of color. So you glaze over existing areas just to kind of adjust them to make them right in relationship to what else is going on. Now I'm kind of employing a little wet into wet around this little segment on the back of the bee. Here's the eye. All right, I had to pause for a moment, but now I'm back in action here. So now I'm just trying to delineate the bee. And I'm gonna, I did that segment on the back there, did some of that wet into wet, let the color kind of bleed into itself. Then the wing, there's a kind of outline with there's a kind of veins going on in the wing where the wing's transparent, but then you see these veins. And then there's a segment here. So what I'm doing, I'm kind of outlining it. And then I'm sort of trying to create this little soft kind of edge by I'm erasing the outline just to keep the outer edge of it. And then I'm using that underpainting to show that sense of transparency in the wing. And that is called glazing. So I glazed over that wing a little bit. Here's a nondescript kind of segment. That's dark. And I can't really tell what it is, so I don't have to paint it, but it has a little bit of a glossy highlight on it. So I'm going to make a glossy highlight by just blotting away a little bit for the moment. And I'm going to do the same thing to the eye. And the eye has some really beautiful kind of blue reflective quality. So I'm adding blue. And it has a glossy part on it too. So I'm leaving like a little bit of a highlight. I think I'm gonna blot it away. Right up here. And it's nice, there's a little bit of yellow underneath, yellow brown underneath. So I'm doing the highlight, and then I'm going to come in with some darker color and then do a darker edge to give it some dimension. There. And that's, for now, that looks, okay. And then if I, need to go farther or want to go farther, I can. Trying to get it to be streetable. Like, in other words, trying to get it to be where, yeah, if I had to show this or present it, it would convey the necessary information. Okay, so that's highlighting by lifting, blotting, lifting. Then the body has some darks in here. And I'm using a combination of browns and Payne's gray, equivalent of black. There's this interesting kind of pincer where I don't know what you call it. Is it a beak? But it has kind of a dark outline. And then it's lighter in the middle. So I made the outline with a kind of gray color. And then I'm kind of dissolving a little bit. And lifting out color to make it look somewhat sort of a little dimensional. All right, and just continuing with this body. And layering color over these existing marks that I already made. And there's some reds in there, orange reds. I'm trying to go relatively fast. I'm steadying my arm right now because I want to make some more marks here that sort of mirror the dry brush technique I was showing. So I'm doing some more hatchings. Some of this is going to just dissolve, which is good. And some of it will remain more distinct. And that's probably a good thing in this. In my rendering. There, I'm using these kind of marks that mirror that kind of that fuzzy quality. All right, so going to fill in some color. Just to make it more bee-like. Some yellow in there. Just so I'm putting washes of color over this initial rendering that I created. Going back to my yellow. So you basically, when you're painting, you're trying to get it in character with, you try to get it as far as you can the first time over knowing that you'll have to revisit a little bit. You can't quite get it all at once. So you just try to work in that general direction, knowing that you'll still have to go back and modify a little bit. But you're always building on what you've done. You know, you're not eliminating, or like with acrylic paint, oil paint, you can sort of eliminate and cover over something. With watercolor, you have to just build. You can't really eliminate much. It's just going to be there. And then got to get that pattern in there. I'm going to start with a brown and then put black into it. So here's the brown. These are sort of defining the little segments. My hand is, you can see I'm kind of steadying my wrist because I don't want to put it on the paper because it's going to smear the paint, and it's hard to hold the brush sometimes upright and be steady. So I'm doing that just by steadying my hand on my arm. And while this is dry, now I'm going to come in with some darker version of the black, of the brown. Using the wet into wet a lot. There's this big kind of black section over in the middle here. And I want to add some kind of like reddish brown color here. And some of that. It's almost an orange in the leg. I'm taking the orange out of the palette and then adding it, adding a little bit of kind of neutralizing tones to it. Now, as the paint dries, that original dry brush stuff that I was doing is showing through, and then I can come back and make more of that if I want, depending on, if I believe that it's visually necessary to do that. And now I'm just putting some washes just to make the color a little bit more complex, putting some orangish washes into parts of the body that I feel like could benefit from that. And then you're not really going to get a clear assessment until everything dries. You might think everything is perfect, and then you come back and realize, well, it's all dried and it's way too pale. So then it's good to, at a certain point, just kind of put it away for a minute, a little while, let it all kind of dry naturally, and then just, assess where you're at in the process. Um, Doing some of the veins on the wing, which are kind of just like strokes of the brush. And I press down, lift up, and see what happens. All right, so now this is at a certain state, and then I want to just leave it a little while, and then come back when everything is truly dried and see where it is. It seems like it still needs, some stuff to happen around here in the midsection. But it's not really, dried enough to allow me to kind of understand what's necessary. So I'm just going to leave it. And then try to go back and finish hummingbird. Now, as far as a hummingbird is concerned, what I think I'm going to do, I don't want to waste too much time on the tape, on the video. I'm going to turn it off a little bit, and then I'll pick up a little bit more after I've just sort of finished out a few little underpainting details. Okay, so back to the hummingbird. And I just want to give the hummingbird a little bit more definition. It's got all of the wet into wet washes. And what I'd like to do now is some hatching or stippling, just to bring out the quality of the scale-like feathers on the bird. And it's going to give it a little bit more physical character, a little bit more physicality. It'll be more substantial if there's some more kind of concrete edges in there and so on. But I've got a good underpainting going on there. I did a little bit more work on the eye off camera just because it was kind of technical and boring, but you can see I just did a little outlining there with similar quality, kind of, a wet end to wet wash where, I kind of make a line, a shape, and then drop color in and then kind of lift out a little bit of it just so that it looks more organic. And then you can see where the eye is a combination of both blue and that deep Payne's gray, which helps it to look a little bit more reflective and transparent at the same time. The eyes are, the pigmentation is somewhat transparent because you're looking through the lens and so on. All right, so the last thing I want to do on the bird, it's looking passable, but I want to just give it a little bit more definition. So I'm going to come back with some hatchings, and I'm going to go over these areas to get those kind of scale-like some of those scale-like feathers. And I'm going to try to also keep somewhat, I'm trying to keep my color true to the color that's underneath it. So here, I'll do a darker color. And then as I transition out here, I use some of that lighter color. Now, it probably can't be exclusively line, I might have to go in and, dab additional color in there. But I think that'll bring a lot more kind of, it'll create a much stronger impression of kind of the physical surface of the bird. Just make it look more solid, more real. So I'm kind of just bringing that green out. Yeah, the feathers they're interesting. They're very, all I can think of is they're kind of scale-like. And then they go from kind of a green to sort of a brown. In some areas, they're more distinct than others. And I'm somewhat following these initial patterns that I had created with the wet into wet. Very rainbowy. And in the areas where it's, oops. In the area where it's kind of whitish, and maybe some just suggestion of like a little gray. And then this is always something that you have to just take stock of, assess, the scales get a little bit more foreshortened where the bird's breast is turning, so they wouldn't be as broad or as round. Maybe just more kind of marks. And I'm careful to sort of change my colors as I transition from one area to the next. Yeah, that's helpful. And then I go back and kind of look at what I've done. Maybe create a little more dimensionality on some of those. And then the ones that aren't working, lift away. Just lifting away a little color. There. I need some brown over here. When you're going to do a shadow, sometimes you have to neutralize the color a little bit. So I have some blue, green, and I add a little brown to it just to kind of make the color a little duller. There, I like that, you know, basically. You know, maybe in a perfect world, I'd come back a third time and make some small adjustments. Each time you're hopefully making fewer adjustments. And where you're just arriving at, you know, just the little tiny things that will make it really distinct. Let's try to put some of these marks on the head. Hold this up for a moment. Kind of see how that looks. You know, there's certain things, you know, you just go, oh, that's not quite right. So then you manipulate it a little bit. Can't show everything in the world. You're just trying for something in character and something that's going to make it valuable as a painting. You know, what can you do? What can you do to this that makes it, you know, what can you communicate in the painting that cannot be communicated in a photograph? You know, what's unique about it as a painting, as opposed to, you know, what's unique about it as a photograph. You want it, you know, you want it to have this essential quality that, you know, cannot be conveyed any other way. So you might be working from a photograph, but then the end result is not just to make it a photograph, it's to kind of add additional information. So then it's kind of its physical. Physical qualities are really important, you know, because a photograph isn't necessarily physical, it's just like a window. But it's just telling you not to look at, it's just telling you to look at the illusion, where a painting is a thing. And I don't want to do this everywhere else, it gets monotonous. but just enough to give it some, to convey some unique qualities about the surface. I'm dissolving these little scale-like shapes a little bit, just so that they're not so strong. Dropping a little red in there. With oil acrylic paint, you might be kind of highlighting there. You can't really do that with watercolor if you're not using white. And we want to initially just refrain from using white. It doesn't do the same thing. It just doesn't have the same capabilities as what you think of as adding white in an oil painting. It's just going to be different and not quite as effective usually. But that's not to say you can't use white. But initially, it's better if we don't go there, so that we learn to focus on the watercolor's transparencies. Transparent properties. All right. So I'm just going to manipulate these, just kind of make them less distinct. That's pretty much it. The only thing I feel like I could do in addition is this edge here. If I'm not going to have a background, then I want to have a more distinct edge. So I can make a little bit of a border. My brush right there in the breast. And then dissolve the inside edge so it's not too, so the line isn't too, strong. There. The wings are flapping, so they don't need as much definition, but one could do some outlining. Just to kind of suggest the movement. All right, so that's anyway, that's how one might handle these different elements. Let's go over them again. Wet into wet. This sort of thing, this underpainting. Blotting, lifting, kind of taking areas out where you put the paint down and then you pull it out again. Dry brush, didn't do it in this painting, we did it in the Bumblebee. Hatchings or stipples for texture. We did it in a little scale-like feathers. Edges, we didn't, edges, we haven't talked about edges. Just try some lines here. I'm going to put this aside. In terms of edges, if you want a soft edge, a couple of different ways you can do it. You can paint into a wet surface, which will give you a soft edge. So there's a wet surface, and I'm going to come in with some paint. And the wetter the surface, the more the paint moves. So that's a soft edge. You can always start with a soft edge and then come back you know, as the paint dries and come back and get like a darker core. That can look really beautiful. The other thing you can do concerning edges is make, you know, you can kind of have, well, for instance, we haven't done a flower yet. Say we're going to do some here's an image. It is a columbine flower. So I want to have like a hard outside edge. Like that, maybe. Here, one more. So this is my columbine. This is supposed to be yellow, but I was too impatient. All right, this is my columbine flower. And maybe I want to get a rounded form, but I want a sharp edge. That's where you can come in and kind of outline. And I did this in the prior demonstration. Kind of outline the edge. And that makes the form really crisp. And if you like the outline, you can certainly keep it. Or you can come in and dissolve the edge. So you get a crisp edge on the outside and a softer, more blended edge on the inside. And I was doing a lot of that. So, and you know, one can just keep going with that, you know, sharper, darker lines, darker edges. You know, you just keep adding more. So anyway, that's I added an edge on that, just as kind of an accent. And just to kind of make it really sharp. So the darker, obviously, the darker the line, the crisper it's going to be. You need, you know, obviously you need to have some contrast. And I'm kind of blending these colors. So soft edge, dark edge, just depending if you're working into soft edge, hard edge, depending if you're working into what kind of surface you're working into. A wet surface will give you that, which could be great. And then a dry surface gives you that. But then you can manipulate the edges just by, dissolving them on one side or the other. And that's a method that's used a lot just to get form down. Here's the stem. And the same could be done with the stem. By the way, if you want a green and you want kind of an earthy green, then add some red to it, or maroon. Sometimes that looks better than just adding more green. And then this sort of thing where the green, I just did that stem to make it kind of perfect. If the green's coming into the red, then again, you blot it away, let it dry, and then you can come back and fix it at some point. Add some darker green. I have enough water to make it flow off my brush. Yeah. Anyway, even something that simple can be a range of colors. Sometimes the marks you make, and oftentimes the ones that are just really direct, are the most beautiful marks of all. But this would really have to do with, edges, how one treats edges. There, let that dry, then, a couple shadows, whatever, and then you're good. It's just finished. Finally, back to this bumblebee. It's looking pretty good. One final thing I might do is try to just clarify some of the internal parts of it. So then if I increase contrast, like say on the leg, then the leg stands out a little bit better. Maybe over here. Some more shading against the wing. And then finally, there's this midsection. Right here, where there's a lot of fur, fuzzy stuff. I can't really, well, I'm trying not to add white, and white's not going to necessarily do what I want it to. So I can dissolve. And let me hold it up. I started doing that a little bit. I started dissolving the paint right here to get that furry stuff because I needed to highlight the area, but it's very dark and the fur is lighter. So I'm just dissolving the paint wherever I want to highlight. So I'm just making these marks in the paint and lifting. Takes a minute to dissolve. Just using the tip of my brush. There, so I lifted out some highlights, which help in this area. And then just to make them sharper then with less, using less water. And I can go back and kind of shape them a little bit. I'll hold that up. So this is the highlighting happening here. And then, you know, if one desired greater detail, then you just keep kind of manipulating in that way until, you know, whoops, I was a bit impatient there. So you just keep manipulating until you get the basic form that you want to have. And then you try, you know, the biggest struggle is to know when to stop and not to overwork. But initially, it's better to overwork rather than underwork, because you know, if you don't learn as much if you don't try to take it a little farther. So I think that concludes the demonstration, and I hope that's helpful. I'm going back and kind of reinstituting my dry brush. Can't stop. But yeah, one just kind of hangs with it until there's a good result. One final mark. There. And that'll dry, and then we'll see what happens. Okay. End of demonstration. Hope that's helpful.